They didn't hear the surrender, only the jungle, cicadas like static on a broken radio, rain that erased footprints and truth. In August 1945, when the emperor's voice finally floated across Japan, telling his people the war was over, there were men in the Pacific who heard nothing but wind in the palms and the click of their own safety catches. For them, the war did not end. It went quiet. In the last months of the conflict, as American forces closed a steel fist around the Philippines, Japanese field commanders issued orders born of desperation and doctrine: disperse, hide, survive as long as possible, and never surrender. The message was simple, absolute, and repeated until it fused with bone. Hold your post until relieved. In a military culture that taught death before capture and obedience as oxygen, those words weren't instructions, they were identity. On tiny islands dotting the Sulu and South China Seas, squads melted into ravines and cane thickets. They cached rice in bamboo tubes and wrapped ammunition in oilcloth. At dusk, they moved like shadows along creek beds, memorizing the shape of every limestone ridge. They learned the jungle's grammar, how a flock's sudden silence meant a patrol nearby, how the smell of wood smoke could travel like rumor, how a bent grass blade could be a tripwire or a sign of safety. And then the world shifted in a way the jungle could not explain. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, a voice on the radio, high, formal, unlike any soldier had ever heard, announced the termination of the war. In villages and cities across Japan, people wept or simply sat down, stunned. But on Lubang, on Guam, in the backcountry of Mindoro and Mindanao, the air carried only rain. The men waiting there, clerks turned riflemen, boys hardened into scouts, kept to their routines: boil rice, oil the bolt, split watch in 2-hour shards. They saw American leaflets drift down like pale fish. Japan has surrendered. Hostilities have ceased. They turned them over in calloused hands and decided: forgery, psychological warfare. The enemy would say anything to make you come out. Some heard rumors from captured fishermen. Some found newspapers in ruined shacks. None of it pierced the order that anchored them. The emperor's voice was never theirs to hear. Their commander's last words were. And those last words were iron. Seasons began to replace calendars. A new moon meant longer patrols. Typhoon season meant traps washed out. The men grew lean and careful. Boots rotted. Feet learned the feel of root and stone. They sharpened machetes on river rock and stitched uniforms with vine fiber, turning themselves into silent, practical myths. Locals glimpsed them and told stories. The mountain spirits, the ghost soldiers who slipped in to steal bananas and salt and were gone by morning, leaving only neat footprints and the feeling of being watched. What they fought now was not America or even the Philippines. It was doubt. Doubt that the order still held. Doubt that the empire still stood. Doubt that the man next to you would keep believing when your stomach sounded like distant artillery. Doubt was the new enemy, and the cure for it was ritual. Inspections at dawn, passwords at dusk, maps drawn from memory in the dirt. If the war lived in the mind, then you fed it with discipline until it breathed on its own. In Tokyo, the rising sun was lowered. In the jungle, it kept beating in the throat. And among the holdouts, men with cracked hands and eyes trained to the sway of grass. One name would come to define the war that would not end. A young intelligence officer dispatched in 1944 to a small island west of Manila, sworn to obey until death or relief. His rifle would not rust, his belief would not bend. Hiroo Onoda had not yet stepped into legend, but the jungle was already making room. For the villagers, the war had ended years ago. For the men in the jungle, it had only gone quiet. In the dense green labyrinth of Lubang Island, a few hundred miles southwest of Manila, the air was thick with the ghosts of 1945. The American landing had driven the Japanese garrison into the hills, where survival became a form of worship. The enemy was no longer soldiers in uniform. It was doubt, disease, and the sound of one's own conscience whispering, "It's over." But to Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda and his small band of soldiers, there could be no over. Their last order, delivered by their commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, still echoed like a commandment. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come for you. Until then, fight." They believed him, and so they fought. At first, their existence was methodical, military. They hid rifles in bamboo caches, collected rainwater in tin helmets, and rationed what little rice remained. They made shelters from palm fronds and old parachutes, drew maps from memory, and conducted reconnaissance on Filipino villages they believed were occupied by the enemy. When they found leaflets dropped from planes declaring Japan's surrender, they examined them under moonlight, convinced they were Allied forgeries. "The enemy is cunning," Onoda told his men. "They will do anything to make us surrender." Every few months, the outside world reached for them. Families back in Japan printed letters, photographs, even messages from their mothers, dropped by the thousands from aircraft. One of the men found his brother's handwriting and still refused to believe it. If Japan had lost, he reasoned, our families would be dead. Logic had rotted like their boots, replaced by ritual and faith. By 1950, the jungle had swallowed them completely. Onoda led 3 remaining comrades, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. They called themselves a unit, maintained ranks, and held councils under the trees. When one of them fell ill, they treated him like a soldier, not a friend, bandaged him, saluted him, and kept moving. The locals began to fear them. Every so often, a hunter disappeared, a farmer was shot, a carabao stolen for meat. To the villagers, they were the mountain devils, spirits of war haunting the forest, exacting revenge. The Philippine government sent patrols to capture them, but Onoda's training in guerrilla warfare made him elusive. He'd been taught to use terrain as a weapon, to vanish into the foliage like a shadow. For years, they lived in a cycle of invisible battles, raids for supplies, skirmishes with police, nights spent listening to the rain drum on leaves. They saw American planes flying overhead, then jet planes, faster than anything they remembered. The world had changed, but the jungle didn't care. Till the late 1950s, the 4 men had aged into ghosts, their uniforms mended with scraps of cloth, their rifles cleaned with palm oil, their discipline untouched. When Akatsu, the youngest, finally lost faith and surrendered in 1950, the others believed he'd been captured and turned by the enemy. The war will never end for us, Kozuka said one night by the fire. And in a way, he was right. The Second World War had been over for more than a decade. But for these men, it had simply gone underground into the roots of the jungle, where time itself had surrendered first. They no longer fought for Japan. They fought as Japan, the last fading echo of an empire that refused to die. By the 1960s, the world had changed beyond recognition, but not for Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda. He still rose before dawn, still wiped dew from his rifle, still scouted the perimeter of a war that no longer existed. In his mind, Tokyo was under siege, and the emperor awaited reports from loyal men hidden in the jungles of the Philippines. To everyone else, he was a ghost, a rumor, a name whispered in bars and army mess halls. The Japanese soldier who never surrendered, they said, shaking their heads. To the villagers on Lubang Island, he was a phantom of violence. Each year brought more sightings, burned rice fields, stolen livestock, bodies found near streams, all marked by precise bullet wounds. Onoda's bullets. He wasn't mad, he was military. When the war ended, Onoda had been 22, a young intelligence officer trained in guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and counter-propaganda. The army had chosen him precisely because he was obedient, resourceful, and cautious to the point of paranoia. They'd told him to destroy airfields and harass American troops if the island fell. They never told him to stop, and so he didn't. His tiny command had dwindled. Private Akatsu had deserted, wandering half-mad out of the jungle in 1950, clutching a rag for a flag. He told Filipino soldiers that his comrades would never believe him. He was right. Onoda called him a traitor, declared him compromised, and erased his name from the unit's records, though those records were now carved into bamboo. In 1954, a firefight with a search party claimed Corporal Shimada. A bullet from a local policeman struck him in the leg. Onoda treated the wound as best he could, but infection set in. When Shimada died, Onoda wrapped his body in leaves, saluted, and swore to continue the mission alone with Private Kozuka. 2 soldiers against a world they didn't trust. The decades passed in a haze of discipline. They patrolled by moonlight, avoiding villages but raiding fields for rice, fruit, and the occasional cow. They maintained their weapons meticulously, repaired uniforms with thread pulled from parachutes, and recorded enemy movements in notebooks made from scavenged paper. And every few years, something would fall from the sky. A leaflet, a magazine, sometimes even a letter. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. Return home. They read each one carefully, dissecting the fonts, comparing the paper quality, analyzing the phrasing. Onoda had been trained to identify psychological operations. "This is clever," he'd say, holding a printed newspaper. "They've improved their forgeries." To him, the modern world was propaganda. The airplanes that roared overhead, faster and sleeker than any from 1945. Experimental US models, the radio voices in Tagalog and Japanese, announcing Olympic Games and new prime ministers. A trick. Even photographs of the emperor in civilian clothes were dismissed. "Impossible, Onoda," said. His Majesty would never dress like that. Reality bent itself around his conviction. The locals tried to reach him. In the 1950s and 60s, Japanese officials organized expeditions, shouting into the forest with megaphones, playing old military songs through loudspeakers. Once, Onoda's own father recorded a message begging him to come home. It drifted over the trees and vanished. Onoda wrote in his jungle logbook, "Enemy using imitation of father's voice." Very convincing. He trusted nothing but the mission. By the late 1960s, Private Kozuka and Onoda were the only ones left. Two men, middle-aged, with grey streaks in their hair and calloused hands that no longer trembled. They had long since stopped counting the years. For them, it was still Showa year 1944. The war still raged. The emperor still waited. When a local farmer tried to speak to them, they fired warning shots. When police tried to capture them, they fought back. To the villagers, they weren't soldiers anymore. They were ghosts of empire, men eaten alive by their own orders. But to Onoda, every dawn patrol, every rationed bullet, every heartbeat was proof that he was still loyal. He was doing what his country had asked of him. He was still a soldier, and until someone came to relieve him, in person, by rank, and by name, he would never stop. By 1974, the jungle had turned into a museum of one man's war. The trees that had once been cover were now old friends. The rifle in Hiroo Onoda's hands was older still, its metal worn smooth by 30 years of sweat and rain. He had long since stopped thinking about victory or defeat. Only one thought remained, solid and unyielding as the blade of his bayonet. The war is not over until I am ordered to stop. Then one day, a stranger appeared. His name was Norio Suzuki, a 24-year-old adventurer from Japan, with a child's curiosity and a vagabond's courage. When reporters had asked him why he was traveling alone through the wilds of the Philippines, he'd grinned and said, "I'm going to look for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman." In that order, everyone laughed. But Suzuki was serious. He had grown up in a Japan that no longer understood the men who fought its wars. The country was wealthy now, neon-lit and obsessed with progress. The generation of his parents wanted to forget the past, but Suzuki wanted to find what Japan had lost, its stories, its ghosts. After days of trekking through the heat and vines of Lubang Island, he found a small clearing littered with footprints, clean, deliberate, military. Then, at the edge of the trees, he saw movement. A man in tattered khaki, wearing a faded cap, a bayonet gleaming faintly in the sun. Suzuki raised his hands and called out in Japanese, "Onoda-san, the war is over. Japan lost. You can come home." The man froze, his rifle leveled, his eyes narrowed with suspicion sharpened by decades of isolation. For hours, they spoke across a gulf of disbelief. Onoda demanded proof, the emperor's words, the names of his commanding officers, the unit code of his division. Suzuki, trembling, answered every question he could. When Onoda asked what year it was, Suzuki said 1974. The jungle fell silent. 30 years, but Onoda still refused to surrender. "If the war is over," he said quietly, "my commanding officer must come and relieve me. Otherwise, my orders remain." Suzuki promised to return, and he did. Weeks later, a helicopter landed on Lubang carrying an old man in civilian clothes, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the same officer who had given Onoda his orders 3 decades earlier. When Onoda saw him, he stiffened, saluted, and presented his rifle. Taniguchi read a formal statement from the Japanese government declaring that all combat operations had ceased and that Onoda was to lay down his arms. For the first time since 1944, Onoda let the jungle breathe without him. He removed the cartridges from his rifle, wiped the barrel, and bowed. Then, slowly, he stepped out of the trees. At the base of the hill, Filipino soldiers and journalists watched in awe as a man walked into history, his uniform neatly patched, his sword polished, his face calm. He handed over his Arisaka rifle, still functional, his ammunition, his dagger, and several hand grenades, all in working order. He was 52 years old, the last Japanese combatant of the Second World War. The Philippine president, Ferdinand Marcos, granted him a full pardon for the villagers he had killed in mistaken attacks. The crowd that gathered to see him off didn't know whether to cheer or stare. He had lived through 3 decades of peace, as though it were war. When Onoda finally boarded the plane to Tokyo, he pressed his hand against the window. Below him, the jungle stretched endlessly green, the only battlefield he had ever known. He didn't smile. He simply whispered, "Mission complete." For the first time in 30 years, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was going home. Tokyo, 1974. The city blazed with neon. Bullet trains screamed through tunnels. Television antennas rose like steel forests, and the faces of the emperor now appeared not on war banners, but on postage stamps. When Hiroo Onoda stepped off the plane at Haneda Airport, he walked into a world that had outgrown him. Crowds lined the terminal. Reporters, veterans, the curious. Some waved flags. Others just stared, unsure whether to salute or apologize. Before them stood a man in a hand-sewn uniform, his sword polished but obsolete, his salute absolute, perfect, but meaningless. He bowed deeply. "I am sorry," he said, "for the trouble I have caused." For 3 decades, Onoda had obeyed a single order. Now, the entire nation had to reckon with it. To the young, he was a relic of fanaticism, proof of how blind obedience could twist duty into delusion. To older generations, he was a symbol of endurance, of a loyalty that transcended reason. Newspapers called him the last samurai of the emperor, but Onoda himself felt none of it. The country he returned to wasn't the one he had fought for. The discipline and hierarchy he'd lived by were gone. Japan was democratic, peaceful, and prosperous. Everything his training had warned him to resist. The soldiers were gone, the war ministry abolished, the emperor now a quiet figure in a suit. In interviews, Onoda's voice remained steady. "I did what I was ordered to do," he said. "A soldier must never surrender." When asked whether it had been worth it, the years lost, the lives taken, the loneliness, he paused. "I was a soldier of my country," he replied, "and my country forgot me." For a while, the government gave him a small pension and a medal. Crowds came to hear him speak, and people sent letters from around the world, some calling him a hero, others a fool. He read them all, but what disturbed him most was the noise of modern Japan. Cars, advertisements, laughter. "The spirit is gone," he said to a reporter. "Japan has surrendered in another way." Within a year, he left. He moved to Brazil, bought a ranch, and disappeared into the quiet rhythm of planting and harvesting. A different jungle, this one green with life instead of ghosts. There he lived among other Japanese immigrants, men and women who worked the soil instead of the rifle. Sometimes he'd visit schools to speak about his past. He told children about loyalty, but also about thinking for themselves. "You must know when to obey," he said, "and when obedience becomes surrender." In 1984, he returned briefly to Lubang Island, not as a soldier, but as a friend. He donated money to build a school there, the same island where he had once fired bullets into the trees, convinced every shadow was an enemy. The villagers forgave him. He planted a tree in their soil. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014, at the age of 91. For nearly 30 years, he had fought a war that existed only in his mind. Yet his story endures because it asks a question larger than any battlefield. When does duty end, and when does humanity begin? He was the last soldier of an empire that no longer existed, the embodiment of a lesson written in the silence of the jungle. That loyalty without conscience is just another prison. And so, in the green heart of Lubang, where the rain still falls like the ticking of a clock that never stopped, the jungle keeps its secret. Somewhere beneath the leaves, the echo of his footsteps lingers. Not the march of a soldier, but the slow return of a man who finally learned that the war was over.